Okay, so this is a lesson about extended definitions. This is a neat thing to be able to do. You can use it in a lot of different ways in your life. And as a technical writer, someone who would be writing instructions or explanations, you need to be able to do an extended definition. So what it is it's a definition that's like a paragraph long. It's more like an explanation. And it does start with the sentence definition, which we've already done. And I'm going to talk about that a second here. And then you expand it into a paragraph. So here are some ways that you can extend your definition. So the first one is adding a picture or a graphic. That's pretty self-explanatory to show the people what you're talking about, right? Use an example to show what you are talking about. So you would say, as an example, if I'm defining what is a body of water, I would say bodies of water might include lakes, rivers, streams, and oceans, something like that. I might describe how something works. So if I say that I'm defining a paperclip, I would say it is used to hold many pieces of paper together into a bundle. So so you would say how something works, what it's used for, something like that. You can separate the thing into smaller parts and describe each one. So if I was defining a clipboard, I might say the clipboard is made of two pieces, a board, which is the hard piece that you could use to write on, and then a clip, which is normally made of metal that opens and closes to hold the papers on the board, right? So I'm talking about each piece. You can use compare and contrast to explain the definition. So for instance, if I was explaining a softball, I might say it's similar to a baseball, but larger and not as hard. So I used compare and contrast there. I compared it to a baseball. I contrasted it by saying how it was different, okay? You can use something like an analogy. So people will say this often. It's like saying the central processing unit, which is part of a computer, right, is the brain of the computer. So I'm using the analogy of saying that the central processing unit is a brain, right? So you could also point out in the definition what it is not. So this is usually used if the thing that you're defining gets confused with other things. So an example would be there is something called an ambulatory patient. What that means is that patient can get up and move. They're ambulatory. But you could see how people get that confused with an ambulance. So in the definition, you might say an ambulatory patient is not a patient being moved by an ambulance, right? And then you would go on to talk about what it is. Okay. Another cool thing you could do is discuss the word's history. So if it's like a newer word, something that's just come into being, you might want to explain where it's coming from, right? So if I was going to define Facebook, I might want to explain where that name came from. So for instance, here, if we're talking about what is spam email, right? It actually comes from a Monty Python skit. And there's more that I can tell you about that if you want to know. But that's what spam email, that's where that name comes from. Okay, so those are some ways. There's 8 different ways that you can expand a definition. And when you expand a definition, you're using quite a few of these, okay? You don't just like use one, you use quite a few. So here's an example. So a formative assessment, so this is the sentence definition. We're starting with that. A formative assessment is any tool used by an educator to measure the level of learning of his or her students during the teaching process in order to adjust the instruction to the needs of the learners. That is my sentence. That is the definition. But that in and of itself doesn't really help to explain the whole thing. Like it needs more explanation to really understand it. So we're going to go into more definition. Many people do not realize that formative assessments exist. However, without them, students would be treated like cookies, each exactly the same as the other. Formative assessments are many times confused with summative assessments, but their differences are important. Summative assessments are used at the end of a teaching block to measure the learning accomplished during that time, whereas formative assessments are used many times throughout the teaching process in order to gauge learning and adjust instruction. Another difference between the two types of assessments is that summative assessments normally take a more traditional form like a test, project, or essay, but the formative assessment will typically be more fluid in its form. Okay, so that is compare and contrast. How are summative assessments and formative assessments the same? How are they different, right? Some examples of formative assessments are exit tickets. As students leave the room, they have to hand you a ticket filled out with an answer to a question, a solution to a problem, or a response to what they've learned. Worksheets, discussions, question and answer sessions, and even observations. So here we're giving examples of what is a formative assessment. These assessments are then examined closely by the teacher to find any misunderstandings or gaps in learning from the lessons taught. A well-planned and utilized formative assessment will be one of the most important tools a strong teacher will implement if he or she is concerned with the learning of each individual student in the class. It is like the old carpenter's adage, measure twice and cut once. Okay, so the end here is more about how it's used, like we talked about that, and then there is an analogy at the end, how we're talking about how important it is to measure something before you make a decision. And then, of course, there's also a picture graphic showing what a formative assessment might look like. And there's also the references here at the bottom. If this person looked to get help online to talk about this, here is the reference. So that is how you put together an extended definition.